As software developers, we would have created applications using OAuth authentication, where we would have read user information from the access token, and the access token might have been stored in the web browser's cookie without HTTP flag. If you have done any of that, then this video is for you. There are a lot of common misconceptions about implementing OAuth authentication in the application, and there are other questions that a developer might have during the time of implementing the OAuth authentication. So this video is going to answer most of the questions they might have. The reason for this is OpenID Connect is using OAuth flow for its authentication process. To better understand the difference, we first need to understand what an authentication is and what authorization is. Let's say you're trying to access application A, and the application A wants just your username and not your password. So you are entering your username and you are hitting the button login. Once you hit the login, the backend system would read the username that you have entered, and it will check the access list to see if your username is against the application. So if it is available, then it will say you have access. If it doesn't find your username against the application, then it will say you do not have access. And this process of restricting, allowing or disallowing the user based on the access profile is called authorization. If we had noticed, there is nowhere we are checking the genuineness or the authenticity of the user. This is where the authentication comes into picture. So the user would have already registered into the system with their personal information such as first name, last name, date of birth, address, etc., along with the user credentials such as username and password. When the user inputs the username and password, the system would automatically run through the list of users that has already been registered in the application and will be able to match it up with the corresponding user and will be able to pull the user information based on it. And this process of pulling the information from the system and validating is called authentication. Getting to the point, there is a very good analogy at OAuth.net where it compares OAuth to a chocolate and authentication to a fudge, where to make a fudge, chocolate is the main ingredient, whereas it can exist on its own as well as a chocolate, whereas for the fudge, it has Keycloak or OpenID Connect as its other ingredients. We have already mentioned that OpenID Connect is going to use one of the OAuth grant flows to establish authentication. It could be either code grant, implicit grant, or hybrid grant flow. Say for example, if we take the code grant flow, if we inspect the URL of the authorization point, then we could find a key called scope. And when we inspect the value, it would be a list. And if we look at the one of the value in the list as OpenID, then it means that the current OAuth flow that you are trying to use is using the OpenID Connect to establish authentication. Once the scope is set to OpenID in the authorized URL endpoint, the consecutive token endpoint, if successful, the authorization server would respond with a JSON key value pair, and it would contain the ID token in it. The ID token is in the format of JWT and it has three parts. The first part is header. The second part would contain the key value pair of claims that is requested by the application, and the third part would be the signature. It usually contains username, email ID, user first name, user last name as subject, audience, server that issued the token, etc. The answer is yes and no. The ID token is not intended for the agent, it is intended for the client. The client could be either a backend application running gateway or a proxy application, which could store the ID token and the access token in a secure manner in a database. In case of implicit grant, this would be impossible. The reason being, there will not be a backend involved in case of implicit grant. So it is impossible to store it in a secure HTTP cookie. The recommended way of storing the ID token in case of implicit grant is either to encrypt and sign and store it in the browser storage, or to actually store it in the application itself, which obviously is a drawback since on every refresh you need to generate the token again. The audience for the access token is not the client, it's actually the resource server, and the access token should be opaque to the client. And this is yet another reason why access token should not possess the user information. So the access token has to be stored in the backend similar to the ID token. However, in case of implicit grant, access token would end up being saved in a browser similar to the ID token. It has to be stored securely to avoid compromises. If a person has access to the access token, then he or she will be able to impersonate and gain access to the secured resource from the resource server. There is no specific format for the access token and it completely depends upon the service provider. The access token should not be used to store user information and it should be only used at the time of making request to the resource server. As mentioned earlier, there is no specific format for the access token and it completely depends upon the service provider. So the validation also depends upon the service provider. In some cases, the access token might be in the JOT format where the third part would be the signature, in which case we can use the JOT's public key to actually verify the signature. In some cases, providers would provide an introspection endpoint to actually validate the authenticity of the access token. I tried to answer few of the commonly asked developer questions. If I had missed any other questions, please leave it in the comment section below. I will try to answer them as soon as possible. Thanks again for watching. See you in the next one.